からだけど怖くて君が遠くなっちゃうからこのままずっと何も知らないでこの距離感でいたいよ少し不器用で少し大人な雨上がりの空に虹をかけようその涙キラキラに変わるこの先にはどんな素敵が待っているのかな私から降るか じ合える現れてこぼれてくワンチャンスつかめセンセーション真実にこだわって探り当てたミステリアスピース君らしさのかけらかそう私を作ってゆく世界中で一つしたらする自由言葉思いがもっと解き明かしを広がるスタディ許し合えたら君と出会って生まれたさあ飛ばそう君を連れて駆け出すよ誰も追いつけない場所へ今こそ叶えようよあの日の約束片隅の幸せのつぼみ銀色に輝いた咲いたら見せてあげよう見返したアルベル南の方から染まってゆく季節ただいまと言ってねきっとすぐに迎えに行く君を連れて駆け出すよ誰も追いつけない場所へ今こそ君のことをおかえり私をもう二度と置いてかないで
Yeah, to the Insane Presence channel. It's and some are interested in live at 60 frames per second. And their release game, Destiny 2, does not function with game capture. You can use streaming experience for the end user and, of course, the viewers. Now, I had to do a lot of research on this topic to really find a definitive answer, and when it came down to it, I didn't really find a definitive answer. I found some random little things that led me to the conclusion that I've gotten to, and which I'll be explaining in this video. But regardless, if you're having these issues, hopefully I can help you address some of them and get them figured out. Now, granted, this video does assume that you have a decent processor and you're not being limited by your CPU in terms of encoding. So if you're running, say, like a quad-core i7 and you're trying to, hit like near Twitch's max bitrate at 60 frames per second, so around 5,500 kilobits per second, then chances are your limiting factor is your CPU. This can be very easily identified by looking at your OBS window and during intense sequences where you're outputting 60 FPS at pretty much your max bitrate. If it says anything like CPU encoding limit reached or encoding overload, then this is probably not the video for you. For this video, I'm using an R7 1700, that's 8 cores, 16 threads, and that is overclocked to 3.8 gigahertz. So typically, even in intense scenarios, unless it's in a very poorly optimized game, The Division, typically you won't see super high CPU usage, hovering in the 50 to 60% range, unless it's a game that very heavily leverages your CPU, even with these more intense encoding settings. This is primarily addressing the issue that comes up where if you're looking at the stats page, which if you're curious, if you simply go over to view and then stats in OBS, it'll open a nice little window which gives you all sorts of data and analytics and stuff about what exactly is going on your stream in real time. Now there's several things to keep in mind here and things that you need to sort of take into account. The current output FPS, which of course should, if you're doing this correctly, should be pinned at either 30 or 60 FPS depending on your desired output frame rate. The average time to render frames, the frames missed due to rendering lag, which is the primary one we'll be focusing on, and skipped frames due to encoding lag. This last one primarily has to do with CPU bottlenecks, as I previously mentioned, so that will not be super important. The two we'll be focusing on here is average time to render frame and frames missed due to rendering lag. The average time to render frame is a good representation of how long it's taking your system to basically finish compressing a frame, put all the elements together, compress it, and then send it out. So if this number is higher than roughly like 3 milliseconds, then you're probably getting close to a bottleneck. Typically mine hovers around, when I have everything optimized properly, around 1.9 milliseconds during when I'm actually live, with some random spikes if there's spikes in motion on screen or whatever the case is. Typically you want this to be as low as possible for things to be as smooth as possible, as real time, all that stuff. Granted, it's not super visible to the viewer, and it's more so about syncing up frames correctly. If you have frame times jumping all over the place, then it can cause a stuttery looking stream even if you're technically not dropping any frames. So typically you want this to hover around the same, render time for each frame if you can, in a very small chunk. But more importantly, if you're seeing those FPS drops in the lower right hand corner of your OBS window, this will be due to the frames missed due to rendering lag. So you might be wondering, what the heck? I bought a fantastic Intel CPU with lots of cores, or I bought a new Ryzen 7 chip because it said it was good for streaming. Well, truth is, it's actually fantastic. I do not regret buying my Ryzen 7 1700 at all, but the issue does not actually lie with your CPU. Now, little known to me, but of course now that I know this, it does make sense, and now that I understand how OBS renders frames, it makes entire sense, and I'm not sure why I didn't come to this conclusion earlier. OBS does require a little bit of GPU power to, render frames. It's not much, but it does require a little bit. So typically you'll be running into missed frames when your GPU, while playing a game, is pegged at 100% usage. And this can come from numerous things. Obviously, this can come from high frame rates, this can come from high graphical settings, anything that's putting load on your CPU, even if you're, say, playing a game and watching your stream preview on the Twitch dashboard in another monitor, that stream preview does use GPU resources. Again, not very much, but when you're playing a game and streaming at the same time, you need as many resources free as possible, since OBS tends to, to eat up all of those resources. And if you've got, say, 3 different feeds basically playing at the same time, you've got your OBS preview, you've got your game, and you've got your Twitch live dashboard, playing your stream preview, that's going to put, that's diverting a lot of attention to several different programs. So basically, when it comes down to it, if you're seeing those missed frames, that's typically due to the fact that your GPU is being completely utilized by most likely the game that you're playing. And this comes mostly into factor when you have like an unlocked frame rate, or at least a frame rate cap that's very high, like close to like 200 frames per second. And a lot of the times in most games, unless they're exceptionally graphically demanding, you can get rid of this missed frames thing basically just by limiting your frame rate to something more realistic. Typically, I just limit it to 60, since, I have a 60 hertz panel and I don't really need anything higher than that, especially since I value output quality over necessarily hitting maximum frame rates on like my local setup. Especially since when I'm streaming to Twitch, I'm never streaming any higher than 60 frames per second. So typically what I'll either do is, if there's an in-game frame rate limiter, I'll turn that on, and you'll see a massive drop off in GPU usage pretty much immediately from just doing that, again, unless the game is extremely graphically demanding and you were only putting out roughly 60 FPS to begin with. That's when things get a little bit more complicated, and this part is kind of disappointing, I'm not gonna lie, but you gotta do what you gotta do, man. So typically at that point, if you limit your frame rate, especially in games like Overwatch, where if you've got a decent mid to high end GPU, you'll be pushing well over 100 frames per second. If you limit your FPS to 60, typically that will get rid of your encoding lag or whatever, or your missed frames lag just pretty much immediately. That's how it basically has worked for me since I'm running a GTX 1070. But if that still isn't working and you're still seeing occasional drops in output FPS, then you might try lowering your graphics settings to even further reduce the load on your GPU, since again, like I've been saying this whole time, OBS does require a tiny bit of GPU resources to encode each frame. Again, it's not much, so if you are able to get your GPU to hover around 90% usage, like when playing games, either lowering your graphics settings or even just like say setting your FPS to like 90 or something like that, and you're still seeing GPU usage, whether it's in the task manager, since that's a new great feature in the Fall Creators update, or through something like MSI Afterburner or any other manufacturer's program that allows you to monitor GPU usage. If you're seeing around 90%, that while you're playing your game without OBS active, I'd say that's typically a good benchmark, since when I've been streaming and whatnot, I usually notice only about 5% GPU usage from OBS specifically. Again, it does vary depending on the motion in the scene and what exactly is going on, your output resolution, all of that stuff does play a factor in the performance of OBS. But typically limiting your frame rate will fix it if you've got a decent GPU. Again, if you're running with a weaker GPU, you may potentially need to lower your graphics settings to free up a little bit of GPU horsepower to push towards OBS, but for the most part, that seems to solve the issue. Another thing I briefly wanted to touch on is the use of game capture versus monitor capture. Monitor capture, as you can probably guess, captures a specific monitor as designated through the sources list or whatever in OBS, which is a fantastic tool, especially if you're trying to record or stream your desktop. But this is notoriously unoptimized when used for recording or streaming games. Again, there are certain games that will not work with game capture, so sometimes you're just kind of shit out of luck and you gotta use it. But if the option is available and it's functioning properly with whatever game you're playing, use game capture at all times. To my understanding, this basically hooks into the 3D renderer that the game uses, OpenGL, DirectX, whatever the case is, and it sort of latches onto it that way and injects code in so it can record it natively, so to speak, similar to Shadowplay or Fraps or DxTory, although DxTory is limited to DirectX because it's DxTory. But as a result, and since it's not necessarily trying to capture that monitor's output and it's mostly just focused on that game, that's typically more optimized than using monitor capture. I have seen a lot of reports of game capture having issues on Windows 10. Personally, once I applied the fixes that I've just previously talked about, I never ran into those issues again, so perhaps that's a problem for some people and not for others. But if you're having that issue, of course, then monitor rate, lower your graphics settings, check your GPU usage. If you're pegged at near 100% when you're having these missed frames or whatever, that's probably your culprit, especially if you're seeing low CPU usage on a higher end CPU. And everything, guys, thank you so much for watching. Appreciate all you new subs. I'm going to try to get back to uploading around once a week, but again, I can't make any promises. My life is very hectic right now. and I just had to pick up a bunch more work at my actual job because one of the other managers quit, so now we're having to pick up slack. But yeah, and of course, if you want to see me just chilling and playing games and stuff, since that's typically what I do when I get home from work or whatever, I just kind of chill over on my Twitch channel.